It's interesting that when we disregard the Sabbath, and keep in mind that the Sabbath is a day of what? Of rest. Okay, so when you are not resting, what happens? You become restless. Okay, you become restless, yes. You either get exhausted or and that's a lot of problems in society today. And Jesus, in this context, invites people to do something. Sister Burek, next.
Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light.
Okay, so Jesus come unto me, and I will give you what? I will give you rest. Okay, but you only get rest when you do what? When you take my yoke. So we find that in coming to him, we need to take up the yoke or yoke up with him in order to find rest. And what is that yoke? Hannah.
Thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways and see, and ask for the old paths, where is the good way, and walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your souls. But they said, we will not walk therein.
Okay, so this yoke, because notice it's the same thing here as standing in the ways, asking for the old paths and walking in the old paths. Why? Because the result of all that is finding rest for your souls. And Jesus says, come unto me, take my yoke, and you shall find what? Rest for your soul. So it's exactly the same thing. Now, one of the oldest paths that we can find on earth is actually in the Garden of Eden. And so in Genesis chapter 2, let's read verses 2 and 3. Marco, you're next there. You want to read there next? Genesis 2, verse 2 and 3.
And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made.
All right, so what we find here is that when we go to the Old Testament, all the way back, as we're looking at old paths, we can't go any older than the Garden of Eden. And there you find that God rested on the seventh day, he blessed that day, and he sanctified it. The word sanctified, another way it's translated in the Bible, is hallowed it or set it aside. When we look at the Sabbath, we find that it has special meaning. Who's next there that can read it next? Rafaela, can you read there? Ezekiel 20 and verse 20.
And hallow my Sabbath, and they shall be a sign between me and you, that ye might know that I am the Lord your God.
Okay, so we find here that the Sabbath is a sign between us and God. That what may happen? That we may know which God we worship. Now, why is it so important to know which God we worship? Is it Karina's next? Go ahead.
That they might know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent.
Okay, so what is eternal life? What is eternal? Knowing God. What's the sign that we know God? The Sabbath. Remember, it says, the verse there we just read there in Ezekiel, it shall be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. Okay, so it's a sign that we know God. Therefore, it's a sign that we have eternal life. That's why true Sabbath keeping is so important for us. So now, when we look at the Sabbath itself, we find the Sabbath commandment in Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. Can you please read those there, Susie?
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
All right, so we find here the reason for the Sabbath is because God created heaven and earth and rested on the seventh day. As a result, it says, wherefore, or because of this, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it, or sanctified it, or set it aside for holy use. It is the sign or the power of God to create the universe. But you know something, the Sabbath is not just going back thousands of years, reminding us of creation. There's another creation that the Sabbath is an important sign of. Let's take a look. Hudson, let's start with you there.
Clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me.
Okay, so do what? Create in me a clean heart. So God creates in us a new heart. So when we experience conversion through the creative power of God, guess what? What do you end up with? You end up with another sign. It's a sign, it's a remembrance of the creative power of God. Brother Joe there, if you can read for us there in Testimonies where it talks about the importance of the word remember.
The very beginning of the fourth commandment, the Lord said, remember. He knew that amid the multitude of cares and perplexities, man would be tempted to excuse himself from meeting the full requirement of the law and would forget its sacred importance.
Well, that we need to remember something, isn't it? When you say remember this, I mean, it's very important, and God knew they were going to be very busy. It's a very busy time today. In some countries, people have Wednesday night meetings, it's fully attended. Friday night meetings, it's fully attended. Sabbath, all day, morning and evening, and then Sunday evening meetings and all this type of stuff. And, well, in those societies, they're not very busy, actually. They have time to do that. You go into a faster society that we live in, and we have a tendency to not have that much time. And so God says what? Remember. In the midst of your busyness, remember something very important. So, because the Sabbath is so important, what should we in the ministry be doing? Rose, there, if you could read the next couple slides. Volume 6, 353.
In establishing new church, ministers should give careful instruction as to the proper observance of the Sabbath. We must be guarded lest the lax practice that prevail among Sunday keepers shall be followed by those who profess to observe God's holy rest day. The line of demarcation is to be made clear and distinct between those who bear the mark of God's kingdom and those who bear the sign of the kingdom of rebellion. All
right, so what we find here that we need what? Careful instruction in the proper observance of the Sabbath. And many times we learn about the Sabbath and then we want to keep it the way Sunday keepers keep Sunday. And that's not how it is. There's an actual distinction. So there needs to be a line of demarcation between those who serve God and those who serve Him not. Therefore, what is God calling for us to do in regard to the Sabbath, Brother Gessner?
For more sacredness is attached to the Sabbath than is given it by many prophets, Sabbath keepers. The Lord has been greatly dishonored by those who have not kept the Sabbath according to the commandments, either in the letter in the spirit. He called for a reform in the observance of the Sabbath.
So God is calling for a reformation on what? On Sabbath keeping. It's not just to go to church and that's it. There is far more attached to it than that. So let's consider first of all the day that comes before the Sabbath. We call it the preparation day. Before we go into that, can a person who is lazy keep the Sabbath? properly? No, why not? Because we just read there in a moment ago in the fourth commandment, 6 days shalt thou labor, and then you do the rest. Okay, so it didn't say rest 6 days and then labor. No, it says what? Labor. So we need to be a working people. So when should we be thinking about the Sabbath? When we know the Sabbath is coming, at what point during the week should we be considering the seventh day? Hannah?
All through the week, we are to have the Sabbath in mind and be making preparation to keep it according to the commandment. We are not merely to observe the Sabbath as a legal matter. We are to understand its spiritual bearing upon all the transactions of life. They will bring into daily practice the laws of His kingdom.
All right, so when are we to be thinking about the Sabbath? All through the week, okay? You got to plan. You know, many times, we're planning things. I know, when I'm traveling, oftentimes, especially when I'm going long distances, I plan to actually arrive on Thursday. When I'm traveling to another country, I've always planned to be there on a Thursday. I see a lot of people, they try to be there on Friday. They don't want to lose time, and so they come there on Friday, and oftentimes Friday afternoon, and there are inevitable delays. And I see people often breaking the Sabbath because their flight was delayed, and they tell me it was out of my control. No, it was in your control. Why? You should have got there Thursday. And many times I have planned to arrive on Thursday, and because of delays, you end up on Friday. And it's not a problem for me. Why? Because I've already planned that in there. It was not a part of the problem. So we need to be planning our week in relationship to the Sabbath. Now, next is Marco, I think. So just give it to the next person who is there in line, and we're going to be going right across. So give them the next one to be ready. So here, how does the Sabbath affect our home life?
And all that pertains to the success of God's work, the very first victories are to be won in the home life. Here, the preparation for the Sabbath must begin. Throughout the week, let parents remember that their home is to be a school in which their children shall be prepared for the courts above.
All right, so we find here that the very first victories are in the home. Therefore, when we're talking about Sabbath observance and Sabbath preparation, it must begin in the home. That is where we need to target. And so continue on.
Let their words be right words. No words which their children should not hear are to escape their lips. Let the spirit be kept free from irritation. Parents, during the week, live as in the sight of a holy God, who has given you children to train for Him. All
right, so you have there during the week is where you need to be living the Christian life. And then when Sabbath comes, it's not all of a sudden like a switch turns on and you're a different person. It's the same person that was there. I remember hearing a story years ago of a deacon in the church, and he noticed a child was out there trying to find something at the front gate of the church. And so he went over there to see, maybe I can help you find something. And the child said, it's here somewhere. It's got to be here somewhere. And he said, what are you looking for? Can I help you? He says, I don't know what I'm looking for, but it's here somewhere. He says, why? What makes the thing? He says, because there's a line right over here. Something happens across this line. And as soon as we drive across the line, my parents are completely different. You see, and he says, I need to know what is making this change. And so what's happening is many times, we're showing a contradictory lifestyle to our children. Let's go now to the biblical day. Rafaela?
And God saw everything that He had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day.
All right, so what we find here is that when we are considering a biblical day, it begins in the evening and then it goes to the next day. And this same principle we find in Nehemiah. Let's look at Nehemiah 13, verse 19.
And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut, and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants set I at the gates, that there should no burden be brought in on the Sabbath day.
All right, so what happened here? When did he get everything ready for the Sabbath? When it began to be dark before the Sabbath. So as the sun is setting, that is when the Sabbath actually begins. On the Day of Atonement, we find specifically there on the Day of Atonement how it is to be observed.
It shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest, and ye shall afflict your souls. In the 9th day of the month at even, from even unto even, shall ye celebrate your Sabbath.
So the Day of Atonement was celebrated when? From evening to evening. That's how the Day of Atonement was celebrated. Okay, now, therefore, what we find here is that the Sabbath has a special designation. Let's actually start here with Hudson there.
And now when the even was come, because it was a preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath.
All right, so what do you call the day before the Sabbath? The preparation, or what we say is the preparation day. Now, when we are looking at the Sabbath, we have to consider kitchen duties. Let's look at Exodus 16, 22 and 23. It's the two slides there, if you can read them.
And it came to pass that on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for the one man, and all the rules of the congregation come and told Moses. And he said unto them, This is that which the Lord had said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which we will bake today, and settle seed that we seed, and that which remain over lay up for the you to be kept until the morning.
So during the wilderness, they had the manna. The manna came on the day before the Sabbath. On the 6th day, they were able to collect twice as much. During the rest of the week, if they collected any more than they needed, it actually spoiled. You couldn't keep it for the next day. But on the preparation day, you can collect double, prepare it for you for the next day, which is the Sabbath. And then on this day, the day of preparation, you're going to bake what you're going to bake and seethe what you're going to seethe. The word seethe simply means to boil. So basically, it is when you are cooking. So you are baking and you have cooking. The dictionary, another dictionary says that actually in the same way, the seething. So it is the matter of cooking. So all your cooking is to be done on the preparation day. Notice what the Spirit of Prophecy says, and you can read the next 2 slides, I think it is.
The Lord is no less particular now in regard to his Sabbath than when he gave the foregoing special directions to the children of Israel. He required them to bake that which they would bake, and seethe, that is, boil that which they would seethe on the 6th day, preparatory to the rest of the Sabbath. Those who neglect to prepare for the Sabbath on the 6th day, and who cook food upon the Sabbath, violate the 4th commandment, and are transgressors of God's law. All who are really anxious to observe the Sabbath according to the commandment will not cook any food upon the Sabbath.
And one more.
They will, in the fear of that God who gave his law from Sinai, deny themselves and eat food prepared upon the 6th day, even if it's not so palatable. God forbade the children of Israel's baking and boiling upon the Sabbath. That prohibition should be regarded by every Sabbath keeper as a solemn injunction from Jehovah to them.
So very clearly here that we are not to cook any food on the Sabbath. None of that is to be done. And of course, this was done on which day? Next, Hannah.
There was something to be done in preparing the heaven-sent bread for the children of Israel. The Lord told them that this work must be done on Friday, the preparation day. This was a test to them. God desired to see whether or not they would keep the Sabbath holy.
All right, so what we find here is that it's clearly on a Friday. Now, what happens if we don't finish everything on Friday? The next two slides.
And that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. And the women also, which came with him from Galilee, followed after, and beheld the sepulchre, and how his body was laid. And they returned, and prepared spices and ointments, and rested the Sabbath day, according to the commandment. Now upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came unto the sepulchre, bringing the spices which they had prepared, and certain others with them.
All right, so what we find here is that obviously they were working on the preparation day. Remember, Christ was crucified on the preparation day. He died at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They had a very short time to prepare his body for burial. They thought he's going to miraculously deliver himself, so they weren't really seriously getting ready for a burial. But once he died, they started getting ready, and obviously it was incomplete. And so what did they do? They rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. They did not continue the work of preparation. And so obviously Saturday night they continued preparation, and finally very early on the first day of the week they went to finish the anointing of the body of Jesus. So something as important as that they delayed because they had respect for the Sabbath. And they wouldn't do anything until the next day, which was the first day of the week. That means we need to be very careful on what encroaches upon the Sabbath day. Three, four.
When the Sabbath is thus remembered, the temporal will not be allowed to encroach upon the spiritual. No duty pertaining to the 6 working days will be left for the Sabbath. During the week, our energies will not be so exhausted in temporal labor that on the day when the Lord rested and was refreshed, we shall be too weary to engage in his service.
There's two things here in this passage here, and one is, excuse me, one is that the temporal things are not to encroach upon the spiritual. And so there are duties that are pertain to the 6 days of working week are not to be left for the Sabbath. Sometimes we think it's so important, well, either you begin earlier or just leave it alone and leave it for the Sabbath to have the spiritual blessings on the Sabbath. The other aspect here is that we are not so exhausted during the week that we're too weary to engage on his service on the Sabbath. Too many times we are very busy during the week and we're working day and night sometimes to make a living. And when Friday comes, we're so exhausted, and Sabbath morning comes and we're too exhausted to do God's service. And then that is also not keeping the Sabbath. Now we should also consider our clothing. Next.
Many need instruction as to how they should appear in the assembly for worship on the Sabbath. They are not to enter into the presence of God in the common clothing worn during the week. All should have a special Sabbath suit to be worn when attending service in God's house. While we should not conform to the worldly fashions, we are not to be indifferent in regards to our outward appearance. We are to be neat and trim, though without adornment. The children of God should be pure within and without.
All right, so what we find here is that we need to be careful on the type of clothing we bring to church on Sabbath. We actually need to have a special Sabbath suit. Sabbath clothing needs to be something special. It's not something that you wear during the week. It is going into God's service, into God's house, and we need to go there with something special. That means that does not mean that we have, obviously we don't go with worldly fashions, but it doesn't mean that we are to be sloppy. We are to be neat and trim. And of course, God wants his people to be pure inside and outside. A Sabbath preparation involves more than food. Next.
On Friday, let the preparation for the Sabbath be completed. See that all the closing is readiness, and that all the cooking is done. Let the boots be blacked and the bath be taken. It is possible to do this. If you make it a rule, you can do it.
Not to be given to the repairing of garments, to the cooking of food, to pleasure seeking, or to any other worldly employment. Before the setting of the sun, let all secular work be laid aside, and all secular papers be put out of sight. Parents, explain your work and its purpose to your children, and let them share in your preparation to keep the Sabbath according to the commandment.
So what we find here is that all the clothing needs to be ready before Sabbath, not something you do Sabbath morning. All the clothing is in readiness, all the cooking is done, all the shoes are cleaned, all the baths are taken, all secular work to be set aside, even secular papers be put out of sight to keep it out, so you don't get tempted in it. And explain your work to your children, because we need to keep the Sabbath according to the commandment. Now, what about some other things about personal grooming? Susie?
The violation of the fourth commandment is not confined to the preparation of food. Many carelessly put off blacking their boots and shaving until after the beginning of the Sabbath. This should not be. If any neglect to do such work on a working day, they should have respect enough for God's holy time to let their beards remain unshaven, their boots rough and brown until the Sabbath is past. This might help their memory and make them more careful to do their own work on the 6 working days.
So we find here very clearly that we're talking about different aspects of preparation, shoes cleaned, even shaving. That is something to be done during the work week. That's not a Sabbath activity. Those are things that we can do before the Sabbath. Now, what about cleanliness? How important is it for us to be clean? In Exodus chapter 19, we have the experience of the children of Israel as they came before God at Mount Sinai. We'll start Hudson again.
And the Lord said unto Moses, Go unto the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and be ready against the 3rd day. For the 3rd day the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai.
That prior to the Lord meeting with them on Mount Sinai, they had to sanctify themselves. They had to dedicate themselves spiritually. But notice here, part of that was the washing of clothing, the washing of themselves. So that is something that is to be done in preparation to meeting God. Now, what happens if this is not done? Let's take a look at the next part of here.
The people are required to refrain from orderly labor and care, and to possess devotional thoughts. God requires them also to wash their clothes. He is not less particular now than he was then. He is a God of order, and those who worship God with unclean garments and persons do not come before him in an acceptable manner. He is not pleased with the lack of reverence for him, and he will not accept the service of filthy worshippers, for they insult their Maker. The Creator of the heavens and of the earth considered cleanliness of so much importance that he said, and let them wash their clothes.
So we find here the importance of cleanliness. So the same God that we worship then is the same God we worship today. He is just as particular now as he was then. We are to have devotional thoughts. And then not only clean minds, but clean garments. Our bodies need to be clean. That means all this stuff needs to be done in welcoming our Creator. And He has placed so importance on cleanliness. He said, wash their clothes before they even come around the mount. They didn't go up into the mount like Moses did, but they had to wash their clothes as they were listening to God give the 10 Commandments. It's interesting, later on when the sanctuary service was developed, they even had to wash their feet in order to enter the sanctuary. They had a laver there all the time so that they can be clean. So God is very clean in regards to that. Now, what about the edges of the Sabbath? What are we to do regarding the Sabbath as it is approaching? Rose?
We should jealously guard the edges of the Sabbath. Remember that every moment is consecrated, holy time. Whenever it's possible, employers should give their workers the hours from Friday noon until the beginning of the Sabbath.
So we find here the edges of the Sabbath. And, when we plan on something, like, for example, when you have a church service, and say the church service begins 9:30 on Sabbath morning, if you plan to be there at 9:30, I can guarantee you will be late. That's just a fact. If you're planning just the exact time, and sometimes I see people, they're looking at the exact minute, and they work right up to that minute and think they're going to be on time. You're going to be late. Okay, in order to be somewhere like at 9:30, I actually aim to be there at 9. And usually you're not there at 9, but at the same time, you'll still be there in time. So that's why we need to look at the Sabbath and make sure that we plan to begin the Sabbath on time. And sometimes, if possible, even Friday noon until the beginning of the Sabbath. So Friday at noon, to be able to take time off to prepare for the Sabbath hours. There is something else that's very important as well. And what about our personal issues? Hannah, I think it's 2 slides there.
There is another work that should receive attention on the preparation day. On this day, all differences between brethren, whether in the family or in the church, should be put away. Let bitterness and wrath and malice be expelled from the soul. In a humble spirit, confess your faults one to another, and pray for one another, that ye may be healed.
We find here that differences between brethren, that should be resolved prior to the Sabbath hours. And this is why when preparation day comes, we're not just talking about physical preparation, we're also talking about mental preparation. And in order to do the proper mental preparation, what do we need to do? And again, I think this is 2 slides here.
Before the Sabbath begins, the mind as well as the body should be withdrawn from worldly business. God has set His Sabbath at the end of the 6 working days, that men may stop and consider what they have gained during the week in preparation for the pure kingdom which admits no transgressor. We should each Sabbath reckon with our souls to see whether the week that has ended has brought spiritual gain or loss.
So that's another work on preparation day as the Sabbath is about to begin. We do need to consider what has been this past week. Have we gained spiritually or have we lost? It's a very important time to get ourselves ready for the Sabbath. And, when we talk about readiness, how do you get ready for the Sabbath? Next.
Then around the family altar, all should wait to welcome God's holy day as they would watch for the coming of a dear friend.
How do you watch for a coming of a dear friend? You know that a dear friend is coming. How do you do that? You get everything ready, and then what are you doing? You are waiting, you are expecting. And so the same thing is in regards to the coming of the Sabbath. Now, in order for us to understand a little bit more, there are some specific things we're not to do on the Sabbath, and there are things that we are to do on the Sabbath. However, our time has run up, and we're going to have to deal with that next week.